Good morning and welcome to the Point. Many of the headlines this week were dominated by the Supreme Court and two decisions that were made about the Affordable Care Act and same-sex marriage that affect Michigan. We'll talk about the impact on the state in later programs. This morning, however, we're talking about the budget process. First, with the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee about the budget just passed and what's next for roads. Senator, let's start with this budget process. The governor was very excited to announce that for 5 years in a row, the budget was done balanced and early, which is something that I know in your time over in the House wasn't always the case. The economics of the state are better, but the process has also changed with these budgets kind of being put into these big packages. The individual line items are looked at and then voted on in bigger pieces. As the appropriations chair in the Senate, a lot of that responsibility fell to you, and I know your staff. Give me your assessment of how that process went, because $54 billion is a lot of money to have to deal with.
It is, and I take that responsibility very seriously. I enjoyed being a part of the process as the Senate Appropriations Chair in the Senate. And I entered this budget process with kind of three overarching principles or kind of guiding goals, if you will. One was to get a balanced budget. We have a constitutional responsibility in Michigan to have a balanced budget. So obviously that was one, and to get it done on time. Like you had mentioned, we were able to get the budget done 5 years in a row, pretty much 4 months ahead of schedule before the fiscal year even starts, which I think is a great thing, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to do that. Secondly was to reprioritize some of our spending. I think it's always good when you're spending $54 billion of the taxpayers' money that you really look at all the programs and programming going on in state government, where we can find efficiencies and consolidate, and just times change, and so there's oftentimes instances where we have to reprioritize and move money around to reflect the changing times and the priorities of the state. So obviously that was an important overarching goal. And the third goal was to try to make the process as transparent and as public friendly as possible. You know, we as legislators and the executive office, we do this every day. It's our job. And we use a lot of abbreviations and acronyms, and it's very technical at times. And so we try to make this, and I try to make this a priority to make it as open and as transparent as possible through the process.
Well, one of the things, and you talk about that, and I find that obviously you guys are much, much closer to it than I am, but even in the 2 decades that I've been covering this, you start to kind of pick up some of that, and you talk about GFGP, and you do all of those things, and people immediately get lost. It's kind of instructive to know what the big chunks are. For example, the general fund, which is that general purpose money, is one chunk. The school aid fund is another chunk, and everything else can be considered the pass-through, restricted, or federal money that's coming back. Is that pretty much the way it breaks down?
I mean, that's how you can break it down. Of the $54 billion, a good chunk of it, not quite half of it, is, like you said, from the federal government. And a lot of these are earmarks and things that we can't change. It's a lot of our health care, public health care. It's a lot of our human services and public assistance programs.
And those two make up about $25 billion?
About $25 billion of the $54 billion.
So virtually half of the entire budget then is all in health care. So
yes, it is. And then the school aid obviously is a big chunk. Most of our sales tax revenue is earmarked in our state constitution for use for public education. And so that is about $14 billion of the $54 billion. So as you start adding these up, a lot of the monies are earmarked. So we really focus on that $10 billion that you talked about. That's general fund, general purpose dollars that's revenue that comes into the state that we have some flexibility with, and that's where we try to move and shift money around to invest more in things that are working and improving and bettering our state, and reduced revenues or spending where things aren't working to reflect the new times and the priorities of the people of Michigan.
It's also instructive to know that out of that general fund, general purpose, there are dollars that are used to draw down other dollars or match federal dollars. And it's not dollar for dollar generally. It may be a 4-to-1 match or an 8-to-1 match. So a dollar spent may return $6, $7, $8 back into the Treasury. So for people who would say, well, if you just don't put that money out there, but there's a big loss on the other end if you don't do it.
No question about it, especially in the Medicaid program. I mean, that's one of the largest expenditures. That's health care for low-income people in our state. Every dollar we put in, the federal government gives us $2 for that health care program. So that's one example where that does tie some of our state resources up, because we do use some of that to draw down federal. The other example would be in transportation. We use a significant amount of transportation revenue to also draw down some federal revenue to help us manage the roads and bridges and the infrastructure of the state.
And lucky for you, you'll get to talk about roads later in this interview, but let's talk first about schools, because I had Senator Hansen on a few weeks ago. He was principally responsible in the Senate for putting together that K-12 budget, and he talked about the fact he was really pleased, he was happy with the cooperation that he got in working not only with the other folks that worked on the budget, but working with schools and elsewhere. And anytime you talk about school funding, you get some pushback. I had at least one viewer who said, well, wait a minute. If the school aid fund is doing so well, why are some schools having to cut programs or have sales or do something to raise funds? So while there is more money going into schools, not all schools are able to continue at the same level. Where's the disconnect?
Yeah, well, the disconnect, it's a good word to use, is we are investing more in public education. Where the money is going, I think, is where there's a little bit of controversy or disagreement. Years ago, before any of us who are in the legislature now were serving, there were promises made to public school employees with pension obligations and healthcare obligations, or commitments for healthcare and retirement obligations. And now those bills are coming due, and we've made a real concerted effort to try to manage that financially. It's not sustainable long term if we don't get our arms around it. So we've been putting literally billions of dollars when we can over the years to invest in our state's retirement and healthcare funds. And so although it's an investment in education, it's not directly in the classroom is what you'd say, but it is an investment in education, because labor in our public school system is by far their largest expenditure.
So when you look at that dollar, if you go to the House or the state fiscal website, the House particularly has a chart, and it shows that there is more money going in, but that doesn't necessarily equate to what we have come to know as that per pupil funding that goes directly back to the classroom. Now, you could break it up that way, but it's going into the MIPSers or the retirement plan, which, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe at the time that Governor Snyder took office, that unfunded liability was equal to maybe a little more than an entire year's budget in the state of Michigan.
All of the retirement systems combined, so not just public
Right.
school, but the other retirement systems, was about $50 billion unfunded liability. So yeah, you're right. It was about the size of one annual state budget.
So tell us where we are in that process. The governor very often says that there's a date at 2030, something that he thinks it would be a good time to run for governor. That's when he projects, if future governors and future legislatures continue, that liability will be funded. Is that kind of where we are?
Yeah, we started, we hope we started a precedent that will continue after I'm gone and the governor's gone, and we have new legislative leaders and a new governor. We hope they'll continue making that investment, because I think it's in all of our best interest to have our arms around that spending, have a plan to how that's all going to be funded long term. And so we hope in 2038, we'll have pretty much the mortgage, if you will, paid off of the state of Michigan's mortgage, and I think that's a good sign and shows that we've got good financial health for the state.
5 years in a row, you talk about getting a budget done early. It's a balanced budget. If you go back in the 10 years before that, look, Michigan was in a really bad financial circumstance, and I'm not sure what governor could have put together budgets that would have worked more easily with the legislature. You also had divided government for some of those years. So there were a lot of different circumstances that made some of that budget process go right up to the end date, and sometimes even beyond the end date, and go all night long. It's a much different atmosphere now, and that's been recognized by some folks who actually look at the budget process around the country. What do they say about Michigan's?
Yeah, well, a report just came out last month. It's a 10-page report from a think tank group out in Washington, D.C. They analyzed all 50 states, their budget process, and Michigan was ranked #1 out of all 50 states about the kind of budget process we have. And I think it speaks highly of the focus we put on a public-friendly, transparent budget process. And it looks at things like, do you have a balanced budget? Do you put money away in a savings account? Do you account for things like caseloads and programming, and be as specific as possible in the budget process so there's oversight from everybody, not just legislators, but people can just browse at their own leisure to look at what the state government is spending their money on. So I thought it was great that Michigan ranked #1, and I hope to continue that by having a good, sound budget process. I hope we continue to lead the nation as far as that process is concerned.
For more years than I'm willing to admit sitting at this desk, I have been watching politics, politicians, and elections, and I have rarely ever seen an issue so soundly defeated that seemed to be supported by so many elected officials as Prop 1 was. That was an 8-2 defeat. Even in baseball, that's not good. But at the ballot box, that's tough.
Yeah, well, it's hard to get 80% of the people to agree on anything.
That's right.
But they did agree that 80% of the people did agree that this was not the right direction in Proposal 1 before the voters back in May.
So that's what the Senate's working on. You guys are meeting throughout the summer, at least certain dates throughout the summer, to talk about that. Again, it comes back to dollars and cents. You're the appropriations chairman, so clearly you're in those conversations. I understand you aren't going to reveal what you're talking about until a deal has been reached, but can you categorize how those discussions are going?
They're going very well, and I do like to remind people that we've been investing more in our transportation in the last couple of budgets. We recognize there's a problem out there. We do need to invest more in our roads and bridges. The controversy or the debate has been, how do we do that? How do we raise more money? Do we look within the walls of state government and find more in different programs and throughout the budgets in state government? So the conversation is going very well. In the budget we just passed for next fiscal year starting October 1, there'll be $400 million more dollars of general fund dollars, which is an unprecedented amount of general fund spending for transportation. Generally, it's gas tax revenue and registration fees, all earmarked dollars in the past that have gone to transportation. So we are spending a significant amount of general fund dollars for transportation. And so I think we're going to continue to do that, and I think you'll see that when I talk about reprioritizing, there are things that we've done in the past that just don't make sense anymore, and so we're going to look within the walls of government. I think you're going to see a significant investment being made by the legislature to continue to make investments in our roads, and I think the people of this state will start to see significant improvements in the infrastructure.
When you talk about roads, there's clearly the impact. We were talking downstairs, we just talk about cars, and there's that, but there's an impact on industry, there's an impact on business, which means that there's an impact on jobs. So when people look at Michigan and want to locate here for maybe some of the reasons you talked about in the report, or some of the other skilled trades folks that we have, and obviously the governor wants to see more of those, but when they look at Michigan, if that infrastructure is not up to par, that can become a real economic drag, can't it?
No question about it. I mean, having a good, solid infrastructure is just a good reputation for our state. From an economic standpoint, it's very important. As people, as business leaders and business owners want to look at states and expand in states and grow jobs in states, they want a good infrastructure system, no question about it. It's good for our families who need to travel around. It's good for tourism, for people to come and visit our state. We don't want to send people home after they have a great time enjoying Michigan's great natural resources, go home and talk about how bad our infrastructure is. So it just reflects, I think, states and the ability how you manage, a state in a good way.
This is one of those moments that we will not dredge back up and say, see, you were wrong. But if you had to guess, do you get a deal put together in the Senate before the fall? And if you do, is that one you can get all the way to the governor's desk?
I think this summer is our goal is to have something done this summer. The House did send over their plan to us. The governor's willing to look at anything that we put together. So I do think we've been working very hard. We've been having meetings throughout the last couple of months to try and get an agreement and put some things together. Our goal is to have something done this summer. I think we're on track to do that, so time will tell.